Welcome to Raising the Bar, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on the country's most successful leaders and how they elevate their business and their teams. Please welcome our host, Alison DePauli.
Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Raising the Bar Live, where we talk to CEOs who have raised the bar in their professional lives. It is my pleasure today to introduce you to Rose Fass, the founder of Fassforward Consulting, a very well-regarded author, publisher of 2 books, The Leadership Conversation and The Chocolate Conversation. And we're going to talk about both of these today and about going from being in the beauty fashion industry to entering the corporate world, to entering the consulting world and growing your own firm. You've had quite a life. Thank you for joining me.
You know, the one thing that I say that the asset to being old, because I'm now 74 years old and I've had about 42 years in business, is that you really don't have to worry about it anymore, seeing something new or not quite understanding, because somewhere along the line in those 42 years, I've experienced it, either in the beauty fashion industry early days or in corporate. Certainly, and now I'm working with corporations, but I'm no longer in them.
Yes.
You know, it's kind of nice. I'm in them, but not of them, is probably a better way to put it.
Yes, and you've charted your own path. And one of the things to me that is quite remarkable is even when you were in the corporate world, you were with Xerox for quite a long time, you were quite entrepreneurial while you were there.
Yeah. I think certain people by nature have an entrepreneurial spirit. You do, Allison. And I think kind of came out of the womb that way, early days with my dad. And later in the beauty fashion business, I kind of had to build literally what would have been equivalent to a startup when I was with Mary Quant Cosmetics and they launched in this country. So I got a lot of early experience with being an entrepreneur. I went to Saks Fifth Avenue right out of college on their executive training program, and it was their first foray into Boston. Mm-hmm. So in a way, another startup, even though they didn't know how it was going to go. They were a New York-based store. It was before all the branches came into effect. This was in 1971. Early days. So I learned a lot. And I share a lot about my experiences with 2 women leaders in Saks and how that whole entrepreneurial spirit lived on even in a very traditional, very conventional corporation.
And when you moved on to Xerox, you had a couple of very interesting conversations and held your ground pretty well. That also, I think, is quite entrepreneurial.
Yeah. The interesting part was what I was completely unaware of. I had met one of the corporate officers through an ecumenical group that had met at the Lance Club in New York. And it was a group of, Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, everybody. It's where I met my husband too, oddly enough. So when I was about to get married, the person that was running that group got in touch with an officer of Xerox because he was a patron of this thing, came all the time, parishioner, I guess. And he said to him, do you know of any women that are interested in leadership positions? Because Xerox is going to hire their first women managers and we want to start a fast track program. So the morning of my wedding, this particular officer, Ron Mercer, God bless him, he met me on the patio of the New Canaan Inn where I was getting married. I was sitting there in electric rollers. My whole family was still asleep and drinking coffee. And he was talking to me about coming out of the cosmetic industry and joining Xerox. And I couldn't fathom at that time being with a copier company, So that honestly, he said, you'll learn great management skills. You'll be so amazed. I will say one thing, the single best training you could ever have gotten in those days, both sales, management, just overall finance, business acumen, phenomenal. And I remembered Miss Janet telling me from Saks that I had to learn the long way home. And I learned the long way home really effectively at Xerox. But being the only female was one thing. None of the other females had been hired from the outside. I was the only one hired externally. So I was resented tremendously by all of the females that were there and several of the men. And as you know, as I told the story in the leadership conversation, the person I had who was my boss at the time, believe it or not, was anti-Semitic. My husband was Jewish, and he decided that I was not, he was very unhappy that I got brought in and put upon him. He wanted an internal candidate. So he stripped my team of everything good and gave me the dregs, so to speak. In my first operations review, I was probably 29 days into my job. And I was presenting, and I'm sorry, it was 45 days in my job, and I was 29% of plan. That's how bad it was. So get up, and they're all sitting back there, all the men, and they all came down from the region and, big corporate guys. And I am under a microscope, and one of them, who they used to call the Iceman, says to me, well, how much talent does it take to be 29% of plan? And everybody's just like sitting there, and I am feeling terrible. And I remembered my dad. There's 2 times you can afford to be strong: when you've got nothing to lose and everything to lose. And I was in both those positions at that moment. And so he said, do you have anything to say for yourself? And I didn't get defensive. I said, well, I've been in the job for 45 days. We certainly had some challenges. If I were 290% of plan, would you attribute that to my expertise? And silence covered the abyss. And David Bliss, who later became a mentor and a friend, turned to me and turned to the guys, and he said, she's making a good point. He said, do you have a plan for how you're going to recover, Rose? And I said, I do. And then I presented my plan, which they were all very favorable about. And the guy who had hired me and insisted that I be in the job kind of worked through trying to help me not lose myself based on this gentleman who literally had it out for me. So early days, life.
Can we talk for a minute about how important executive training programs are to develop leadership? Because I think there are fewer and fewer and fewer of them, and the leadership of our organizations suffer as a result. And 2, how important having a mentor is. If you're a man or a woman, it doesn't matter, but how important that is for the mentor in terms of pulling leaders up, and for the mentee in terms of finding paths to move forward.
Yeah, I can't say enough. Obviously, we're in that business, right? We're doing a lot of leadership development. There are a lot of executive programs out there that are extraordinary. And, the Center for Creative Leadership, the stuff that goes on at Wharton. But in between those times, there is a need for practical, hands-on, how do I do this differently? And in the years that I spent in business, I came to grips with this thing called the technical, social, political sphere, which I developed as a result of a very bad leadership conversation that was going on between our CEO at Xerox and an outsourcing vendors and our internal executives that were trying to get him to choose a particular vendor. Without getting into the whole story, they were operating 100% on fact and what fact was all about. And what they needed to do was reframe that conversation, because what this guy wanted was to be socially connected to a celebrity CEO, even though that wasn't the best company to choose, and for the outsourcing deal. And I helped them reframe that conversation. And I remember writing down on a napkin, TS&P, technical, social, political. And for me, that moment in Xerox, when I was standing in front of that operating group, I had to position my 29% in the right context. And if I had gotten defensive about it and said, well, he gave me the Drex and took all my good stuff and gave it to the other guy, and you're right, that would have gone down, I would have lost. So by just standing firm and asking the antithesis question, which was, hey, add a 0 to that, would you think I was famous? I think it made a unique difference. So I am now of the belief that there's a leadership gap. We are experiencing it, Allison, you and I have spoken. We have experienced it in our government leaders. It's horrific. All you get is vitriol, people shutting down conversations rather than allowing them to take place. We don't have it in our institutions. In some cases, it's lacking in corporations because people are so focused on shareholder value rather than stakeholder value. There is just a lot that's going on today. So I think it's more important than ever that people start dealing with this leadership gap and how to lead. And there's a difference between managing work and driving performance and leading people who are motivated to do something for you. And I'll conclude with this one thought. I recently had a conversation with one of my CEOs that, has just taken on a role, and he's terrific. But I said to him, just remember one thing. When you operate like a boss, you're going to get compliance. When you operate like a leader, you're going to get commitment. When you operate like a boss, you're going to get compliance. When you operate like a leader, you get commitment.
I think it cannot be stated enough. And I see that so often among our clients, among our vendors, among people that perform customer service for our clients. And in some instances, people have not been well trained. In some instances, they're not being well managed. In other instances, they're not being well led. And I notice a lot less context. People are not good at framing. They're not good at understanding context. So they might answer the very specific question that you asked, but then you have to come back and ask 4 more because you didn't get an actual answer. You only got an answer to this narrow little fact. You encounter that everywhere, and you have a name for that.
Yes. I call it the chocolate conversation. Out of college, I had gotten invited to a BYOC, and I thought, oh, bring your own chocolate. How exciting is this? Because I wasn't really a big drinker. And anytime I went to those BYOBs, I sort of hung on to a drink with nothing to say. Yep. So I felt I'll have a lot in common. These are chocolate. So I baked my killer chocolate cake. And I go to this party and I fully expect everyone to just think that I'm the biggest thing since nickel bread. I realize when I get to this table, this 6-foot long table laden with the most beautiful chocolate confections that I had ever seen. And I realized I put my thing down at the end of the table because it wasn't anywhere near all the beautiful things I was looking at. And I realized I'm in a group of a lot of chocolate snobs here. So I was talking with this one guy, and he was like, God, I could eat chocolate no matter where it comes from or how it comes from. And he's going on and on. And this very thin woman, who was the kind of woman, that you look at and you say, oh, God, does she even breathe? Anyway, she came over and she started talking to us about how she only savored the very best chocolate. And if she was going to eat it, it had to have a certain percentage of cacao and be dark and da-da. And I'm looking at this guy and he's looking at me and he goes, look, when I'm dying for chocolate, I just eat a Snicker bar. So she didn't love that, walked away. Years later, I was sitting in an all-company meeting, actually at Xerox, when we were changing from the copier company to the document company. There was no context, as you put it. Basically, we needed to raise our bar, in your words, Allison, because copiers were becoming passé, and we had to figure out what we were doing and what we were selling that was going to be a unique value proposition to our clients. Long story short, we came out of that strategy session and everybody interpreted it differently. And we were all hauled back in and really reprimanded. And I said, we're having a chocolate conversation. And I later went on to build that over time. And I was invited as a consultant with my partner, Gavin, into MasterCard. And they were trying to stand up a new business. And they had the traditional bankers and they had consultants. And they called the consultants the big bid opportunity guys, and they called the bankers business as usual. And the nomenclature had created a divide.
Imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. A major divide. And we got in the room, and it was the first time I ever wheeled this out. And I just said, guys, if I say the word chocolate, what's the first thing that comes into your head? And I got all these different answers, from really expensive chocolate in Brazil to ice cream to cake, just dipped in strawberries. And one guy said his laboratory retriever. And another guy actually in the meeting, which would not be allowed today, said Holly Berry. And everybody was just like, and I was like, oh my God. So I said, look, at a simple concept like chocolate brings up so many different images, feelings. One person said happy. I want something that makes me happy. Another person said, I won't be satisfied unless it has a certain amount of cacao percentage. Another person saying, but I thought I was getting cake, but I thought I was getting ice cream, but where's my chocolate laboratory retriever? And I thought I had a date with Holly Berry. The truth of the matter is, we are all, so I said at the worldview level, we all understand the word chocolate. At the standard level, which is our expectation, the bar we set for ourselves and others, that level, we immediately are very vocal about it. So when people, their worldview is not visible, but their standard is.
Yep.
So you immediately, that woman that wanted cacao versus the guy who would take a Snicker. We need to understand that when we're doing something as complex as a strategy, or as you often put it, trying to figure out how the pharmacy is talking to the
to the drugstore, to the company. Yep.
Store, the pharmacy, to the company, to whatever plan they're on in their medical plans, it becomes what I call a chocolate conversation. And it's 3 layers to it: the worldview, chocolate; the standard, cacao; the concern. Well, excuse me, I didn't know that I would never eat a Snickers bar. Okay, concern is when people have an unmet need. You talked to me a little bit about a story beforehand, a poor person with a migraine who's suffering in pain and needs to relieve the pain. They're not complaining. They're putting forth an unmet need. Today, employees are concerned they're putting together an unmet need. The pushback on the political system today, unmet need. We are your patrons. We're the clients of what you are supposed to be in service to the American people, to people in Britain or wherever you're leading. Where are you? And you see a guy like Zelensky who steps up and into his leadership moment, right? In a moment. He's an ex-comedian, and no one ever believes that here he becomes the role model for the world because he was there dealing with the concern. Lastly, I would say that when you start with your worldview, you invite opinion, contrarian opinion, debate, all the kinds of things you don't want. But when you start with a concern,
you get a different
opportunity to have a conversation and a dialogue. And what I loved about Stephen Jobs, even though he wasn't a role model leader in every instance, nobody knew they needed 1,000 songs in their pocket. Thought they needed visual voicemail. This man started with what humans were concerned about and latently concerned about. They had not even expressed it because they didn't know what to express. And he went after that, literally created a new standard in the world, in the industry, and reframed everybody's worldview. That's the ultimate unpacking of a chocolate conversation. It's to start with the concern, frame up a new standard, and reframe people's worldviews.
And you can only do that by leading and not by managing, correct?
Correct. Because, the word managing comes from the Latin word managere, which means to cope. My mother used to say to me, "How you doing, Mom?" "I'm coping. I'm managing." That's what that meant. Okay. Now, obviously, we have an expanded view of that word now. When you're managing, you're navigating and manipulating work, and you're in the moment, but you're really getting to plan for a lot of stuff. Managers can plan. Leaders like Zelensky didn't get to plan for their moment.
Right.
Rosa Parks didn't get to plan for that moment on the bus. Okay. All the great people and the great leaders of our time never got to plan when that moment hit them. They were there and they leveled up, as you put, they raised the bar.
You raised the bar.
And that's what this is about. It's how do you find your moment as a leader when you can actually step out of your comfort zone and literally, boom. And one of the great ways is to unpack these chocolate conversations because they're going on all over the place.
Yes. And I think we underestimate the power that a chocolate conversation has to cause tension, maybe is a good way to say that. And I think we often don't address the tension, but I think by addressing the tension, we can diffuse it. And it doesn't have to be ugly. It can be quite calm.
Yeah, it can be quite calm. And the interesting part, you brought up customer service. We did a lot of work with one of the big phone companies on this, wireless company. And literally the customer service rep would get on the phone, not solve your problem, because they somehow figure out the billing issue or whatever it was. And then at the end say, so have I solved your problem today? Because they had a canned closing script, and you'd get customers infuriated. So we got brought in and they said, we want to wow our customers. I said, no, they don't want to be wowed.
They just want their problem solved.
Right. So they said, what do you mean? We want to delight our customers. I said, no, they don't want to be delighted. What they want to do is they want to get off the phone and be pleasantly surprised. Like you go to motor vehicles and it didn't feel like root canal. I'm pleasantly surprised. They basically want their effort reduced. They want you to solve their problem and not give them homework.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, if you can do that, you don't have to wow, you don't have to delight, you don't have to do any of that. Just solve their problem and let them get off the phone without homework, without extra effort, and the ability to say, that wasn't painful. I'm pleasantly surprised.
Mm-hmm.
You know the dread you feel when you're asked to, well, can you call customer service?
Uh-huh. We have an issue right now with one of our clients, and I am now in the middle of listening to 17 recorded calls. And I can tell you the customer service team was very nice and empathetic. Too much homework, not enough problem solving.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
And I had to express that to the management team. And you know, I think you can be clear that there's a problem. You don't have to be grouchy, ugly, or loud. You can be clear. And they were like, it was like a revelation. I'm like, it's not possible that this is a revelation. You record all of these calls. Oh, no one's ever put it to us that way. I like to think I'm a special flower, but I'm really not. And hopefully there will be some change there. But I see that everywhere. It's not unique to this vendor. I just happened to got to listen to 17 recorded calls.
And that is one of the hardest things to deal with, Allison, because when you say I'm not a special flower, you know, years ago, I was with Stephen Covey himself, not the stuff that's become sort of off the shelf. Mm-hmm. He was brilliant. And he said, one simple thing that I'll never forget, common sense is not common practice.
Uh-huh. And we seem to be having more and more challenges that way. And when I step out and I look at that, it is very much, there is a managerial process about how we are going to handle this, but there is no leadership in solving the problem.
Correct. And it's not even a process. What's interesting, and I'd like your listeners to take this in because I've done this now a few times and it's finally hit me. The phone company I was with thought they had a lot of process. What they really had, Allison, was a lot of procedure.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to them, take three things three P's, and they're not the marketing P's. Procedure, which is the rule. It tells you what you can and cannot do.
Yep.
Process, which is a legitimate tool. It is the reciprocal relationship between what you want to do and how you can do it effectively and efficiently. So process gets you to, tells you how to do what to do. And lastly, practice, the last P, that's what you're actually doing. You're in the practice of solving customer problems if you're in customer service. What do you use to solve that problem? If you strictly use procedure, procedure should be a guide, not a rule that stops you from doing what you need to do. And process should be simple enough that it helps you go from A to Z. And that's the thing people fail to realize. I love a good process if it can help me take care of business. I love it. But all these procedures, there's an ancient Welsh triad that says that when the rules are so invisible that it lends itself to empathy in a country. So oddly enough, to apathy, not empathy, apathy in a country. But why do rules cause apathy? If you look at a lot of these governments where it's total control and dictatorship and the people can't think for themselves anymore, that's what we do to these customer service reps. We don't give them the power and the agency to think for themselves. And so what do they become? Apathetic. And even though they're kind and they're showing empathy, they're apathetic because they can't get anything done.
Yep. And that leads to a multiple of problems, including turnover, which is a very expensive problem to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the leadership gap gets wider and wider because leaders if you want to control, you will never, ever have people that are going to go through a wall for you and figure out how to do it themselves. I was doing this recently on performance, and you'll get a kick out of this. We were asked to help with performance reviews. Why we're not, quote unquote, leaders providing performance reviews. So I went and talked about it. Huge amount of work, a lot of documentation. And if someone's not performing, you're the one that gets put on performance improvement as the manager because they drill you and they grill you and it's not worth it. So I got thinking about this and I went back to my little son, who I love and adore, now 38, very successful. But at the time he was getting in middle school, he's getting called back every day after class for not doing his homework. And so they called it callback. He'd sit in detention and they would make him do his homework. And then it sent him home. And I said, what is with this callback? Then I went to a president's club and my father and mother are watching him. And they're like, Dad calls me up and says, my Marine father, this is the callback kid. What's with it? The broken pencil to this. So I thought to myself, he got put in his place by that school. And they basically said, not doing your homework anymore in callback. You're going to sit here. Then you're going to go home, get your homework done, and you're going to come back and sit here again. Because he thought, that's great. I sit here, I get my homework done. Didn't work. So I thought to myself, they're not coming up to his little blue bedroom and helping him out. Later in high school, we're not doing that. In college, a professor's lucky if they give you 15 minutes and you walk in and you're looking for whatever you're looking for, you have the heavy lift, not the professor.
Yep. Correct.
We get into a corporation and we infantilize them. We give them what my old CEO, Lowell McAdam from Verizon, who I thought was terrific, called learned helplessness.
Yep.
They're all of a sudden putting you, well, what are you going to do to help me get better? And I just turned that all around and we changed the whole practice, not the process and not the procedure, the practice.
Yep.
You do the performance plan for how you're going to do better. Bring it to me and make sure you schedule time on my calendar because it's not my responsibility to schedule time with you. So now all of a sudden, the accountability is with the person that should be accountable. Come in, bring your plan, sit side by side, not across the desk, and let me see what you got here, and I'll give you my input, see what you think. We'll negotiate it, and we're done. It changed the game, Allison, in that company.
I'm sure.
It changed the game.
I think personal accountability is very important. I think there does need to be some support around that, right? And I think people need to be free to fail.
Of course.
But I think that's really important. And we have, we recently did a predictive index in our office, and nobody was surprised at who was what, but it really was very helpful in helping us understand how to communicate with each other.
Right.
And I'm not the detail one. Well, if I have to be, I will be, but please don't make me. And it is amazing to me how much the team has picked up the detail and how they changed how they come to me. And it's remarkable what that did for our productivity.
Absolutely. Because everybody has different talents. We all bio into this world with our brilliance and our muddy shoes. And we're not meant to be all things to all people. But the important thing is when you give someone the ownership for their performance, for what they're doing, and you ultimately then become a guide and a mentor rather than the stick and the control freak, it makes a huge difference.
Huge productivity differences and revenue increases as well. I can't say it enough. And we're a small entity and we see it and I see it. We're very fortunate. We have lovely and wonderful clients and very diverse industries. We see it in every organization where there's not this really tight-fisted control and people are allowed to bring a solution, then those businesses grow faster.
Absolutely.
And more happily.
For both the leaders and the people.
Yes.
Because if you think about it, right now, leaders are getting a much more expansive scope than they used to have.
Yes, they are.
5 anymore. And then the layers below that are getting smaller. So you don't wait to the 7th layer before someone touches the work. As one of my chief people officers said to me, and I was sort of stunned, 7 layers before you touch the work. They are now going to have to let go. And let people do more.
So you have a couple of very well-regarded books that we should talk about. One of them is called The Chocolate Conversation.
Yeah, it's in its, I think, 6th print cycle. And I don't know if you can see it here.
I can see it there. We'll do a link to it.
And this is about leading bittersweet change and transforming your company. And it's all about conversation. I recently released a book and the early release is already out, but it will be fully released at the end of August. And this is about the leadership conversation, make bold change one conversation at a time. And we saw Zelensky do it beautifully. You know, he went to the UK and he talked to them about the Blitz. And he went to the United States and he brought up 9/11. And he went to different places to explain what was it like for you to have your country under attack. And he spoke to everyone's listening. I would go as far as to say is that not only does leadership happen in the conversation, I think leadership is the conversation. It happens in PowerPoint. It happens in text messaging. It happens in chats. It happens on the public stage, and it happens when you're one-on-one with people. I had one chief people officer at one point that wrote a text to a young lady and a team that had been doing a tremendous amount of work and just wrote, "You rock." That's all it was.
And that was all that was necessary.
And they were beaming. And it doesn't take a lot of time to do that. And you do have to praise and you do have to constructively critique, but you have to do this with balance, touch and task. Touch and task. And so I look at conversations. I recently said to someone who did a flyby in the hall, and I say this all the time, don't do that, because if someone stops you in the hall and asks you something and you're not prepared to have the conversation, postpone the conversation. Say, you know, this is too important for me to just rattle off something in the hallway. Let me get back to you on this. There are no casual conversations when you become a leader. They get you in trouble.
Yes.
Get you in trouble. We see PR nightmares from casual conversations.
Yes.
You can have an informal conversation, which is human and makes people feel like they're human. That's different, informal, than a casual conversation. And so it's all in the book. It shares all of this stuff on the technical, social, political. Last chapter is on civil discourse and the return of it.
Which we need more of.
God rest his soul, was a World War II Marine, conversant in all of the Romance languages, and a published poet. He once said to me, if you have to shout, you cannot hold up your side of the argument.
Very true. And I think we will leave it with that piece of advice. We will link to both books either in the show notes or the content that goes out, so people know where to find them. By the time this is released, the book will have just come out in its final version. I have already read it. I really recommend it to many people, not just C-suite leaders, but people who are leading and growing and leading teams and even leading your family, because that's leadership too.
Absolutely.
Very practical advice.
Yep. And please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to continue the conversation for any of those listeners out there that want to talk about this and get deeper into it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Allison. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And for those of you that are listening, if you like this episode, leave us a review, give us a thumbs up. It helps us spread the show and know what to bring you next time. And we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Raising the Bar is powered by Altique Consulting, the country's leading independent expert in healthcare cost containment. Astute employers know there's a better way to offer health insurance, and we help them achieve it.